Okay, so this is the other part of that remedy that I'll tack on to the second video. And basically, we've already seen that Amnon, uh, with his brothers, managed to kill. I'm sorry, Absalom, with his brothers, managed to trap Amnon and to kill him at the sheep shearing, and then the story proceeds from there. So there'll be a little bit of a rough transition there, but that hopefully you'll at least be able to track on the story. Thank you. Together, and he makes a plan, and they trap Amnon and they kill him. And that's very upsetting to David. And Absalom knows he's done wrong, and he doesn't come home for a long time. But finally he does come home, and there is a somewhat of a reconciliation. But Absalom's not done yet. Whether what he did from that point on is motivated in the same way is not clear, but Absalom begins to mount a revolution, a coup, so to speak. He begins by being a very flashy politician. He has hair that's extremely long, and it's the talk of the town. And he has a chariot and men that run out in front of this chariot, and he drives through town. And everybody sees Absalom, and they're all excited about Absalom. And beyond that, Absalom has a way with people. He will run across a person that is down on their luck, and that they're wanting to see the king and see if the king would help them out. And Absalom listens to the story very attentively and very sympathetically. And, he says, I just wish that I were king. If I were king, I'd do something about your trouble. He does that again and again and again. And he begins to develop a following of people. Hey, that Absalom is okay. He really cares about people. Finally, Absalom left town and gathered an army. You can see that his power has gone from sort of a political power now to military power. And David hears about it. And the next thing he hears is Absalom's coming to town. He's bringing his army. It doesn't look good. Now, whether David could have just faced Absalom and his army face on with his own men is not clear, but it seems as though David decided he was going to kind of surrender the whole situation. At least he was going to go to a place where he felt more comfortable. And there is a long passage that describes David leaving Jerusalem. And as he does, he is very contrite, very humble. And he gets to a place, sort of a wilderness place, and his men gather, and he has Joab with him, and they wait for Absalom's army. Now, Absalom got to Jerusalem shortly after David left. And one of the first things that Absalom did was to go into David's concubines. And this was, you see, kind of a sign of power. Look at me. Look what I have now. It's mine. It's not his. So Absalom takes his army to face David's army. And David requests that they not harm Absalom. He realizes they got to fight the battle, but try to avoid hurting Absalom. Well, Joab and David's men are successful, and they win the battle. And in the process, there comes an opportunity, and Absalom is killed. And David receives the news of the battle, and then he receives the news after some time, after most of the army has gathered into the town where David is staying. He receives the news that Absalom is dead. And there is another lament from David. David kind of goes up into a second-story room, and he can be heard by the whole army. Absalom! Oh, Absalom! Oh, if only I died and not you. Well, all the soldiers begin to just kind of hang their head. And they're just feeling pretty sheepish. You know, they don't know what to make of all this. And finally, Joab goes to David and he says, look, these men risked their lives for you. They fought valiantly and they won. But you're making them feel crummy. Why are you doing that? You need to show your appreciation for these men. You need to kind of clean up, come down, be in full view of the whole army. And David listened to Joab. He went down from that second-story place and sat in the city gate in full view of his army. Obviously proud that these people had risked their lives to salvage his kingdom. And so David then proceeds back to Jerusalem. He comes back and Well, I had a little technical problem there, ran out of battery. So I'm back and want to just finish this story up. And basically, we've kind of come to the end of David's story. David lived quite a number of years after this incident with Absalom, but we see in the scripture just sort of the tail end of David's life, and it is really an old man who is weak and manages to continue to be king, but his vibrant leadership days are pretty much over. I just want to make a little bit of a comment in comparison of Saul and David. And we see that both of these men sinned against God, but we see a somewhat different outcome, and for one thing, with David, and a somewhat different uh, depiction of the sin of Saul and David. Uh, Saul's sin was a sin of not recognizing the importance of God. God was not at the center of Saul's life and his understanding of the kingdom. And because of that, he neglected to serve God in a proper way, including his worship, the fact that he sort of presumptuously took upon himself at times the sacrifice of animals, which was a central part of worship of God in that time. And so that was the nature of Saul's sin, whereas David seemed to have a deep, abiding faith and understanding of God. Even in the midst of his sin, and when he was called on it by Nathan, he immediately repented. He immediately was sorry for his sin, and he was forgiven and was restored ultimately to fellowship with God, whereas that did not seem to take place for Saul. And so I call it a difference, and I hesitate to use this terminology, but just for lack of better terminology, a difference in that Saul's sin was more of a spiritual kind of sin, and David's was more a sin of the flesh. And the flesh is sort of the stuff that we are composed of. And it's not that it's necessarily evil, but it can war against God. And we see it in the case of David. Well, that concludes second grade Bible. And the next step will be to take a much more bird's eye view of the kingdom and the history of Israel and what ultimately becomes two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. And we don't want to just totally brush over all that, but I feel like we've spent a lot of time on some individuals and important stories that kind of were central to the self-consciousness of the Hebrew nation. And there's some other issues that we need to talk about in the nation that develop as time goes by. So I do hope that you will continue watching this series, and I do appreciate very much. I recognize, hey, I'm just a broken down old preacher, but I thoroughly enjoy preparation. Not real crazy about all the technology that goes with it, but I have just appreciated those folks that have been watching. Not a whole lot of audience out there, but I do appreciate all of you. Thank you. And hopefully you'll see me in third grade Bible in this series, the Bible K through 12. Thank you.